Good afternoon, good morning to some. This subcommittee on national parks, forests, and land will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on wildfire in a warming world, opportunities to improve community collaboration, climate resilience, and workforce capacity. Under Rule 4, Subparagraph F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designee. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or at the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted in the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Without objection, Representative Jared Huffman of California, Representative Julia Brownlee of California, and Representative Doug Lamoffa of California are authorized to question the witnesses in today's hearing. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. With that, I'd like to proceed with my opening statement. First, I want to say thank you to each of the members for their participation. I know everyone has very busy schedules. Very much appreciate you participating today, and I know there is significant interest amongst members, and we will have members jumping in and out of the hearing today as we proceed. And of course, I want to say thank you to the witnesses for their testimony. For those of us that live in the West, wildfires are one of the most immediate and obvious impacts of climate change. Wildfires today are nearly a year-round risk, burning larger areas at higher intensity and this is only projected to increase as the climate continues to warm. In fact, my congressional district was impacted by record-setting wildfires in 2020. Last year, the Cameron Peak Fire and the East Troublesome Fire in Larimer County and in Grand County, respectively, were two of the largest wildfires in Colorado history, both of which were in my congressional district. These fires occurred later in the season and at higher elevations than typical. There are probably two things most Coloradans would say that they love about our state: our communities and our public lands, which is why it's imperative that we identify bipartisan opportunities that will facilitate community protection and ecosystem restoration throughout the West. And I look forward to working with Ranking Member Westerman and Ranking Member Fulcher on those initiatives. We know that climate change is the overarching factor driving wildfires. However, there are also other human drivers that contribute to the likelihood that wildfire will impact people and property. Those factors include increased development in fire-prone areas and near wildlands, coupled with nearly a century of implementing forest policies that prioritize commercial activities too often at the expense of other values, including clean water, wildlife habitat, and healthy fire-resilient ecosystems. The challenges that face our forests didn't emerge overnight. So as we consider opportunities to improve forest health and resilience, we must be conscious of past mistakes and ensure that our policy prescriptions don't simply deliver the same results by dressing up old approaches in new rhetoric. To meet this objective, I proposed robust investments in federal restoration efforts, including a new civilian climate corps designed to address immediate restoration needs and create rural jobs in places like Colorado, Arizona, Nevada, Idaho, Oregon, all across the West, a pipeline for careers in land management and conservation. Even if Congress is able to deliver at the scale that we know is necessary, there's still a need to better prioritize science in targeting investments for the greater long-term benefit of climate biodiversity and community protection. In addition to addressing immediate restoration needs, we need more well-paid, permanent opportunities to grow the federal land management workforce. As the federal budget has shifted towards wildfire suppression, there has been a corresponding reduction in non-fire personnel, costing us land managers, biologists, other scientists with the expertise to plan for fire and improve the resiliency of the landscape in the first place. Although Congress has acted in recent years to increase the budget for wildfire suppression, two things are clear. One, stopping the drain of resources away from the federal land management agencies has not had the desired effect of restoring core capacities. And two, while the fire funding fix ended the practice of fire borrowing, it did virtually nothing to improve the healthcare, pay, or general well-being of those on the front lines of these climate-driven disasters, our federal wildland firefighters. Our witnesses today will provide a range of perspectives at the nexus of climate and wildfire, including how we can promote collaboration, reduce conflict to support more community protection, conservation, and restoration work. We'll also hear about some of the challenges faced by the federal wildfire workforce, the opportunities that exist to recognize these individuals as full-time federal firefighters and to utilize those skills year-round for improved mitigation and response, including their ability to support fire-adapted landscapes. During an active wildfire, we always prioritize the protection of people and property, but here in Congress, we can do a better job of prioritizing our essential wildfire personnel, restoring core capacity to the land management agencies, encouraging more effective collaboration, and better incorporating carbon and biodiversity in land management planning. Finally, it bears repeating that even with substantial investments in restoration, workforce, community protection, it doesn't alleviate the need for more comprehensive action to reduce national and global climate emissions. Conservation of our forests and public land should certainly be part of any climate solution. The Biden administration has continued to pursue their goal of protecting 30% of U.S. lands and waters by 2030. And it may consider how existing collaborative structures and programs can be expanded in order to prioritize restoration work near vulnerable communities, while also identifying those high-value conservation areas that are best managed for their natural resiliency and undeveloped characteristics. So with that, I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. I certainly look forward to your testimony. But first, I will yield back my time and recognize the distinguished ranking minority member from the state of Idaho, Mr. Fulcher, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we meet to discuss an issue of dire importance. Our nation is in the midst of a crisis. Far too many of our western landscapes are being lost to catastrophic wildfires. We have grown painfully accustomed to deadly and destructive blazes wreaking havoc throughout the West year after year. In the last decade, over 60 million acres have burned, with over 10 million acres in the last year alone. The environmental damage caused by wildfires is undeniable. However, the human cost is far greater. Since 2005, over 89,000 structures were destroyed by wildfires, leading to an untold number of deaths and enormous personal losses. Entire towns have really gone up in smoke. Unfortunately, the Republican witness today, Mr. Daley, knows the enormous personal loss of wildfires all too well. Mr. Daley is a sixth-generation rancher who tragically lost most of his herd in the massive North Complex fire just last year in Northern California. Over 300,000 acres burned and 15 people tragically lost their lives. It was the sixth largest fire in California history, the deadliest fire of 2020. Sadly, it was not alone, as California suffered through 5 of top 10 worst wildfires in state histories just last year. Mr. Daley and his family know what good stewardship looks like. They have been ranching in Northern California since 1882. That's 1882, not 1982. And have responsibly taken care of the land, continuing to ignore the ticking time bombs that we have allowed our national forest to become is the opposite of good stewardship. While the frequency of this devastation has blunted some of our collective shock, we must not allow that to turn into complacency. We must also dispel the notion that there is nothing that we can do. The title of today's hearing is Wildfire in a Warming World. And while I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this very important topic, too frequently, many of my friends on the other side of the aisle have blamed climate change for an ever-growing multitude of sins, including wildfires, while ignoring the real culprit of our present disaster. Decades of insufficient forest management, not climate change, have led to overgrown, diseased, and dying forests throughout the West. While a staggering 63 million acres of forest land remain at high risk for wildfire in the U.S., the Forest Service is completing less than 5% of its necessary fuels reduction projects. At this paltry pace, we won't tackle our high-risk backlogs for decades, and we will continue to experience devastating wildfire seasons in perpetuity with no end in sight. Fortunately, Republicans have offered a real solution to this problem. I've previously introduced the Treating Tribes and Counties as Good Neighbors Act, which enhances the hugely successful Good Neighbor Authority by fixing errors in the 2018 Farm Bill that have not allowed tribes and counties to take full advantage of the authority. Recently, I also introduced the Forestry Education and Workforce Development Act, which invests $20 million annually to education programs and at land-grant colleges and universities and technical schools to encourage students to pursue careers in forestry. In fact, half of the witnesses testifying at this hearing today are professors at land-grant universities, demonstrating the need to support these schools as we help train the next generation of forestry professionals. These are real achievable steps that we can take to meaningfully turn the tide against this historical challenge. And I implore my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to come to the table to help us provide them. Mr. Daley and his family deserve better from us, as do all in the Western communities that continue to suffer from out-of-control fires. The American people deserve better from us as well. We must do better. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to your testimony. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Fulcher. Now I'd like to recognize the Ranking Member of the full committee, Mr. Westerman, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Neguse and Ranking Member Fulcher and Chairman Grijalva. I'm so glad that we're having this hearing today. It's a hearing that is important to all of the country. And Chairman Neguse, I know this is an issue that's very important to you as you started a bipartisan wildfire caucus. I know this affects Colorado. It affects all of our states. So these are the kinds of hearings that we need to have. Also want to thank the witnesses for being here today. Like many of you, I was in DC last night for the State of the Union address, but after it was over and after all the interviews, I started reading briefing materials for the hearing today and didn't get as much sleep as I would like. Caught an early flight out this morning and got a chance to read even more of the testimonies. And we've got some good information to go over today. And as Ranking Member Fulcher said, there's 63 million acres at a minimum of Forest Service land that needs fuel reduction treatments. It's subject to high risk for wildfire. We're only treating about 1.4 million acres a year. That's way less than what we need. We have to ask why that's happening. Is it a funding problem? We've tried to fix funding, as has been mentioned, but we've also got a permitting problem, and we've got good laws, good environmental laws that were put in place with good reasons that have been weaponized that are actually stopping the science from happening. We've got special interests and lawyers who are using the rules that were put in place to help our environment actually do detriment to our environment. We've got to take a real look at that. This is a real problem, and I want to borrow from President Biden's words last night. He wasn't talking about wildfire, but I think his words apply to it when he said that doing nothing is not an option. For far too long, we've done nothing. We've allowed these special interest groups to stop all the management plans from the Forest Service, and we've done nothing, so nature's taken over and nature's doing something. Nature's cleaning out these forests at an incredible rate. I know we invite a lot of different views and opinions to the committee, and that's a good thing so that we can discuss those. I know we'll be hearing testimony today from majority witnesses who will advocate for doing less treatment on our federal lands, not more. And with that being said, I would like to ask unanimous consent to submit a letter for the record signed by over 3 dozen scientists advocating for science-based forest management policies and that recognize the carbon sequestration benefits of active management and harvested wood products. The letter directly refutes conclusions reached by one of our panelists, Dr. Law, and it states, I quote, Dr. Law used process models that suggest the forest sector was a net source of greenhouse gas instead of a net sink in Oregon. To get that result, they assume that harvested forests are not replanted, though that is required by law. Wood products were mostly used for low-value, short-lived products. Wood substitutes was of minimal significance, and large wildfire losses were excluded from their data set as uncharacteristic, including the 2002 Biscuit wildfire. Those are some pretty major holes in the research, and what science actually tells us is that thinning and prescribed fire increases forest carbon by as much as 18% compared to no harvest scenarios, which equates to the removal of carbon emissions from 55,000 to 110,000 passenger vehicles per year until the end of the century. In contrast, catastrophic wildfires in untreated areas can release tens of millions of metric tons of carbon into the atmosphere. This was the case last year in California, where wildfire emissions equated to driving roughly 24 million passenger vehicles on our roads for an entire year. We want to get serious about wildfires and about forest management, about what's doing best for the economy, not just for the climate and getting carbon out of the atmosphere, but also for cleaning water, providing wildlife habitat, and providing more biodiversity. Then I asked my colleagues to take a serious look at the Tree Act. It talks about science-based forest management. It talks about planting trees where we need to plant more trees, and it talks about taking care of the forests that we have, and it also talks about markets for wood products so that we can create a bank of carbon, which there's a lot of research, peer-reviewed research, that says that is the most or the best way to reduce carbon using our forest is to manage our forest, to use the wood products sustainably, and to it also, there's research that says that we should be using biofuels that are generated from the forest. We've also got an exciting part in the New Trillion Trees Act that talks about biochar, which is it's kind of new, but it's been around since for over 1,000 years. There's evidence that the Incans used it in the Amazon to increase the fertility of the soil. It also increases the water holding capacity and soil uptake capacity, or water uptake capacity of soils, which is very much needed in the arid West, where you're talking about row crops, grazing, or specialty crops. I can tell you that committee Republicans are ready to rise to the occasion. I'm hopeful that we can work across the aisle with our Democrat friends who really care about this issue, and that we can pass meaningful policy that will address the problem and that will finally start to put our forest back on the road to being healthy and resilient. That take into consideration the changes in climate, the warming and drying conditions. That doesn't mean we should just throw up our hands and quit. There's a way we can manage to get the right basal area per acre, where we can maximize carbon storage on the forest, where we can get larger trees. And as we move forward, I'll be talking more about some of the exciting projects that have happened around the country. But again, I'm looking forward to the discussion today and to the questions. Again, thank you for holding the hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Westerman and Ranking Member Fulcher. Now I'd like to turn to our witness panel. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start, and it'll turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely use stage view or grid view so that they may pin the timer on their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I'll also allow the entire panel to testify before questioning the witnesses. I'd like to welcome our first witness today, coming to us virtually from the best congressional district in the country, Colorado's 2nd District, Dr. Courtney Schultz. Dr. Schultz is a professor in the Department of Forest and Rangeland Stewardship at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado. She is an expert in her field. She specializes in national forest policy and governance, focusing on forest restoration, fire management, and wildlife conservation. She directs the Public Lands Policy Group, a research group studying policy developments that affect U.S. public lands, and leads the university's Climate Adaptation Partnership, which serves to accelerate research and promote communication with policymakers to support effective and equitable approaches to climate adaptation. Dr. Schultz also works in close partnership with the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, one of the Southwest Ecological Restoration Institutes. Dr. Schultz, thank you for coming. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman DeGoose, Ranking Member Fulcher, Chairman Grijalva, and Ranking Member Westerman, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. Over the last decade, I've led extensive research on national forest and fire policy. Today, I want to share with you 3 lessons I've learned: the importance of partnerships, the need for more funding and capacity, and the value of research. Climate change, land use change, and histories of forest and fire management are together leading to more intense and extensive wildfires. In 2020, my home state of Colorado had the largest fires in state history, including the Camera Peak fire, which forced me to evacuate my home. The most cost-effective way to protect human infrastructure is to work in and around homes and communities. But there are also reasons to do work on public lands in our frequent fire forests, to reduce community exposure to fire, protect watersheds, wildlife habitat, and carbon storage, and to maintain other amenities. Forest and fire management are complex challenges. They vary in every place, depending on local partners, economies, and conditions. Therefore, success depends on the work of place-based partnerships, to build agreement and capacity, to work across jurisdictions, and to find innovative solutions to specific challenges. Effective policies use focused investments to support partnerships and collaboration among government agencies, NGOs, private landowners, and industry partners. Recently, we researched the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program and the Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Partnership, programs that support numerous collaborative forest management efforts across the nation. We found that these policies are effective by making prioritized funding investments in particular landscapes and collaborative groups. They support larger scale planning and implementation, innovation, conflict reduction, and capacity leveraging. The CFLRP has supported rural economies and led to outsized accomplishments given the funding investments. We also found that the biggest barriers to progress are limited agency and industry capacity. Still, almost everyone said that these programs mark the path forward. But capacity looms as a major barrier to progress for restoration work. When we investigated why prescribed fire accomplishments have not increased on federal lands in the West, we found that insufficient funding and capacity are the primary barriers to progress. In this context as well, partnerships are critical to getting more good fire on the ground. For example, on forests like the San Juan and Southwest Colorado, where partnerships and resource sharing are keys to success. Incidentally, I want to share that fire managers who worked the Cameron Peak fire recently told us they incorporated 3 areas that have been treated with mechanical thinning and prescribed burns into response operations with good results for structure protection and fire management. Fuels treatments can make a difference. Our interviewees say prescribed burns for community protection should be the priority, and they recommend more connected treatments at larger scales. They reiterate that they need more funding and human resource capacity to implement treatments and to conduct treatment maintenance. There's also a new process called pods, whereby scientists, partners, and land managers work together to figure out when fire ignitions occur in the future, where they might prioritize suppression, hold fires, or reintroduce fire. These processes help partners engage in proactive, collaborative fire planning before emergencies and hold promise for getting more good fire on the ground, which is our best bet for restoring forests at larger scales. So based on these observations, I have 3 recommendations. First and foremost, support partnerships. This can be done through focused investment programs like the CFLRP. Congress might also consider whether there would be value in authorizing the Joint Chiefs Partnership and similar programs for prescribed fire and community protection. Congress will also need to invest in collaborative capacity building programs and attend to the social equity issues related to preparing for and responding to fire. Secondly, current funding and capacity levels are not adequate for addressing this challenge. Partners that I work with estimate that public, private, and tribal forest lands may require an additional 40 to 60 billion over the next 10 years to make the necessary progress for community and forest resilience. For the U.S. Forest Service, the fire funding fix stabilized the agency's budget, but agency funding and workforce capacity must be restored and augmented. Accelerating work on a small percentage of the landscape could have outsized benefits for reducing fire hazard. This work will require a larger agency workforce and will have to be prioritized where there are effective partnerships in place and plans to manage fire at a meaningful scale. Other solutions include leveraging external capacity through better agreement mechanisms and growing a strong external workforce, which would support jobs, benefit rural communities, and facilitate work in the woods. Finally, ongoing research will be important to track change and find solutions. In addition to supporting agency research, Congress should consider restoring full funding for the Joint Fire Science Program, the biggest and most effective program that addresses agency priorities for fire research. Both social and ecological research are more important than ever given the pace of change. These problems are centuries in the making. Success will take time, but everything I've studied indicates that we can accelerate progress with funding and investments to build capacity, robust research, and support for place-based partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schultz. The chair now recognizes Dr. Beverly Law, Professor Emeritus of Global Change Biology and Terrestrial Systems Science at Oregon State University. Thank you for being here, Dr. Law, and you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Goose. Chairman Goose and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today. I'm a Professor Emeritus of Global Change Biology and Terrestrial Systems Sciences at Oregon State University, where I've worked for 30 years. I'm appearing today and representing myself, not Oregon State University. My research includes the effects of drought, fire, and management on forest carbon and land use strategies to mitigate climate change and benefit biodiversity. I will focus my remarks on forest carbon and biodiversity conservation for climate resilience and carbon implications of fire and management. So the next 10 to 30 years are a critical window for climate change and climate action. And we need to simultaneously reduce carbon dioxide emissions and increase carbon storage in land reservoirs of forests. Mature and old forests store more carbon in trees and soil than do young forests and continue to accumulate it over decades to centuries, making them more effective forest-related climate mitigation strategy. These forests also have rich biodiversity, and that means species richness and critical habitat for species, promoting resilience to climate change. When wildfires occur, they mainly combust litter and duff and have relatively little impact on the forest carbon stocks. If trees are killed, the deadwood takes decades to centuries to decompose, and some of the carbon accumulates in the soil. Only a small portion of the total forest carbon is emitted to the atmosphere by wildfires. Another issue is broad-scale thinning of forests to reduce fire risk conflicts with climate goals because the amount of carbon removed by thinning is much larger than that saved, and more area is harvested than actually burned. It also puts much of that harvested carbon into the atmosphere. For example, 81% of the wood harvested from West Coast forests since 1900 has been emitted to the atmosphere or remains in landfills, and only 19% is stored in longwood products. There is no evidence that thinning forests increases biomass stored. Thinning usually removes 30 to 50% of the biomass. That's just standard. About 40% is what it averages. 60 to 80% of the harvested carbon will return to the atmosphere faster than if you'd left it in the forest, no matter what products you put it into. For example, a stand level thinning study in the drought-prone ponderosa pine in Idaho found that removing 40% of the living biomass from the forest would subsequently release about 60% of that carbon to the atmosphere over the next 30 years. Landscape to regional level thinning would be even higher carbon emissions because of the low 1% probability of the thinned area encountering fire during the period of effectiveness of treatments. And that effectiveness period is 10 to 20 years. Then you have to go back and rethin or retreat. However, in fire-prone dry forests with high future vulnerability to fire, which is what we've done with climate models and projected into the future, their local reduction of seedlings and saplings may be useful to protect the large trees. These large trees are more fire and drought resistant and store and accumulate more carbon annually than small trees. Climate change mitigation is expected to be part of the planning. So potential impacts of treatment options on forest carbon should be assessed as part of a strategic decision-making process. And that can be done by an independent group, whatever. We're facing a climate emergency and a biodiversity emergency. Forest carbon and biodiversity are intertwined and need to be incorporated simultaneously into forest planning for resilience. Areas important for carbon storage are also important for biodiversity, as we found in our Western US study and was found globally. We need to protect people and their property while addressing climate change. Integrated climate adaptation and mitigation strategies will yield resilience and less human suffering as we navigate through the climate crisis.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. Appreciate your testimony. The chair now recognizes Ms. Reva Duncan, Executive Secretary of Grassroots Wildland Firefighters and a retired fire staff officer with the U.S. Forest Service.
Thank you, Chairman Neguse, Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Westerman, Ranking Member Fulcher, and members of the subcommittee for allowing me to appear before you today. On December 31st, 2020, I retired from the U.S. Forest Service after 31 years with the agency. My position upon retirement was the Chief Fire Staff Officer for the Umpqua National Forest and Roseburg and Coos Bay BLM districts in Oregon. Over the course of my career, I worked in 5 Forest Service regions on 7 national forests in Pennsylvania, Florida, Utah, California, North Carolina, and Oregon. I have extensive experience on Type 2 initial attack crews, engines, a hotshot crew, heliTAC, and in fuels management. In my position as Chief Fire Staff Officer, I also provided critical agency leadership and guidance during large wildfire incidents throughout the U.S. There is much discussion on the wildfire problem. Larger and more destructive wildfires, a fire year instead of a fire season, significant socioeconomic impacts to communities and businesses, and tragic loss of life and property. Increasing demands on federal firefighters on the front lines have become a year-round requirement. While I am not a climate scientist like Dr. Law, I can attest to the increases in size, intensity, duration, and complexity of wildfires since I started my career. The 5 federal land management agencies have failed to keep pace with this changing dynamic, burdening the firefighters on the ground. The current federal fire workforce is woefully understaffed and overworked, and people are at their breaking point, leaving a wake of mental health issues, suicides, high divorce rates, and very concerning numbers surrounding high incidences of cancers and cardiovascular disease, all from a career of undocumented exposure to smoke, particulate matter, and other effects from hazardous conditions faced on every operational shift worked on wildfires. These agencies rely on a largely seasonal workforce. Many firefighters' tour of duty is 6 months. Several elected officials have called for the Forest Service to create a full-time year-round fire workforce. And while this seems like a viable solution on the surface, it is fraught with unseen consequences that detrimentally affect federal wildland firefighters. As wildfires grow larger and last longer, federal firefighters answer the call of duty, leaving behind their lives and families for upwards of 6 months annually, working in an average of 16-hour daily shifts, sleeping in the dirt, going without showers, working and sleeping in smoke, and given limited time off to reset and reconnect with loved ones. Pushing the current workforce beyond the brink to accomplish more with less on a year-round basis, without a pay increase to support a living wage and increase staffing levels, will only exacerbate these issues and accelerate resignations and more acute and long-term physical mental health issues. Technically and officially, there are no wildland firefighters in the federal government. Most who fight fire are classified as forestry technicians, range technicians, and some are biologists and administrators. Yet all must hold paramount qualifications and meet physical fitness requirements. Wildland firefighters do more than just respond to wildfires. Federal wildland firefighters assist with hurricanes, floods, and COVID-19 vaccinations. They proudly responded to the 9/11 attacks in New York and at the Pentagon and assisted in space shuttle recovery. Yet the agencies won't officially recognize them even as first responders. Because of the embarrassingly low pay, most wildland firefighters must rely on extensive overtime and hazard pay to survive financially. An increase in compensation would alleviate financial burden placed on firefighters and their families and decrease the need for unsustainable amounts of overtime to survive financially. Missing just 1 2-week assignment due to injury or family emergency can translate into a loss of 10 to 20% of their annual salary. Having a stable and plannable income from an increase in base wage would alleviate the financial burden and protect employees from financial hardship in the event of a job-related injury. Firefighters are leaving federal workforce for more lucrative wildland jobs with state agencies, municipal departments, utility providers, and even insurance companies. These are people with many years of specialized experience and training who cannot be readily replaced. In my last 2 years with the Forest Service, we struggled to fill many of our positions. In 2020, for the first time, we could not staff all of our engines 7 days. Last year, firefighters under my charge overcame many challenges. First a pandemic, and then an historic wind event in Oregon and Washington that sent wildfires racing down our canyons and into our communities, destroying homes, lives, and cherished natural resources. I had more firefighters reach out for help with thoughts of suicide, depression, and traumatic events than at any other time in my career. I have driven a good friend to rehab. I have held onto a firearm for another friend who was afraid they would use it on themselves. And I have escorted the body of a fallen firefighter home to their family. I myself have struggled with my own demons after having several line of duty deaths and serious accidents occur on my watch. In closing, I am not here to disparage the U.S. Forest Service. These issues are larger than any one agency and will take complex and expensive solutions. It truly was my honor to serve the U.S. Forest Service and the American people. I loved working in fire, but I love the people I work with even more. I have grown weary of losing amazing friends and colleagues, and I have grown impatient with inaction. The U.S. is burning, wildland firefighters are struggling, and some are even dying. The time for reform is now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Duncan, for your testimony and for your service. We appreciate it. The chair now recognizes Representative LaMalfa for 30 seconds to introduce Dr. Dave Daley, a rancher from Butte County, California.
Thank you, Chairman Goose. I appreciate that. Also, Ranking Member Fulcher. Dave is a person I've known many, many years in my area here in Northern California. His family has grazed cattle on the Plumas National Forest going back to the 1852 era, when his great-grandfather first came during the Gold Rush era. Dave has earned his PhD in animal science from Colorado State. He's also an immediate past president of the California Cattlemen's Association. Currently serves as the chair of the Ecosystem Environment Committee on the Public Lands Council and is chair of federal lands for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. So he certainly has the background. In addition, he served as associate dean of the College of Agriculture at Chico State University, has been an animal science professor for the last 30 years. During the Bear Fire last year, as it was named here in Butte County, which later became the North Complex Fire when it expanded to an area over 300,000 acres, Dr. Daley lost most of his cattle that were grazing in the Plumas National Forest. His devastating testimony should serve as a wake-up call to all of us as legislators to improve forest management, streamline the environmental review process, given that the town of Berry Creek, which burned in that fire, they had actually a fuels treatment project in the works, but the CEQA process had took almost 2 years to approve what was available in a federal grant that also had to go through NEPA as well. So much frustration and much unnecessary loss in the West due to our inability to really get at the problem of the forest management we need to do. So I'm pleased that Dr. Daley, my friend Dave, could join us today and offer his testimony. Please pay close attention because this has been a devastating thing for his family and for all of his neighbors that know him and care about this issue. So thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman LaMalfa. This is Dave Daley. I'm coming to you from Butte County, California, and speaking to you not only as an educator and as a cattleman, but as a victim of catastrophic wildfire. And as you may know, in this community, we experienced Camp Fire, which destroyed the town of Paradise 2 or 3 years ago, and now the Bear Fire North Lightning Complex that absolutely devastated this community. This isn't about retreating to corners about who's right. This is about finding solutions. And I often feel both federally, particularly federally, we have to work on an agenda, and it doesn't deal with the tragic realities of what I saw and witnessed. And until you've experienced that, it's really difficult for me to explain the devastation that occurred. It was dramatic. 200,000 acres in a very few hours. Not only was my cow herd destroyed, but the legacy of my family, my home, the entire ecosystem in the Plumas National Forest was devastated. We could spend a lot of time arguing what caused it, but I would really prefer we think about some solutions instead of simply what the causes may be. That devastating fire was in the watershed of Lake Oroville, the second largest earthen-filled dam in the world, the highest dam in the United States, 3.5 million acre feet. What do you think is going to drain there now? What is left of that ecosystem? That affects our community, obviously. That affects me personally, but that affects all of California. That water system, we don't know yet what the effects will be in terms of the devastation we have seen. So to see that at the scale and scope I have, to spend the time to get access into an inferno, to try and rescue cows, but it wasn't just about my cows. It was about what I saw in loss of wildlife and ecosystem permanently. We've been taking cattle up there since 1880. We'd worked, and I grew up with the Native American community. We're arrogant enough and insulting enough to tell them they can't culturally burn as they did for thousands of years. That's disappointing to me. These are people that their livelihoods, what they did, and many have now lost their homes in the Feather Falls area, were people who knew how to care for the land and the environment at the same time. I remember the last man out stories of the 1800s and the early 1900s my grandfather told me, where both the Native Americans who we learned from and later us would set those low intensity fires to reduce fuel loads, to open the landscape for wildlife. We've lost that. I think you've already heard that from many of the previous speakers. What are we doing to climate change when we introduce in 1 year, we burn 4.2 million acres of California, 10 million acres west-wide, have almost 10,000 fires in California, and we are unwilling to look for solutions. It frustrates me to no end that we put barriers to local decision-making in the way of what we do. The solutions that we would occur, and I realize you're dealing with all the West, but what would happen in a sagebrush ecosystem in Nevada should be different than what happens in the Plumas National Forest on the Front Range of the Sierra Nevada in a large mixed conifer forest, or the grasslands of North Dakota. Yet we seem to think that one size fits all. And unfortunately, we don't consult with those who are impacted. I would invite any of you or your staff to take a tour with me. I hadn't been back since October, except for a brief trip up to look for a Christmas tree that wasn't there. But I took my 90-year-old mother back this last week to see the devastation. She'd spent 72 years gathering cattle there, learning nature, thinking about the botany and the wildlife and the ecosystem. And for her to see that was devastating to me. To have my children, grown adults now, help me gather cattle or attempt to, and to find animals, a calf and a fawn side by side, dead, burnt to death, was almost better than the ones we found alive with their hooves burnt or gone completely. A cub without its mother in a tree with no paws left. A sow bear, a female bear in the water trying to cool her paws. This will not recover in my lifetime. This is a result of federal inaction, and it's not simply the last year, it's the last 60, 80, 100 years. I don't have simple solutions. I would suggest that we could look to prescribe fire. I want to thank the Newsom administration in California. They've been very proactive with us and the Cattlemen's Association to at least begin to investigate solutions to prescribe fire and solutions of grazing as alternatives. So I ask you to think about actually doing something and talk to those of us who are affected. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, and we want to thank again all of the witnesses for their testimony today. Reminding the members that Committee Rule 3, subparagraph D, imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions that they may wish to ask the witnesses. I'd like to start by recognizing someone whom I should have recognized at the outset of this hearing, the distinguished chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, Mr. Grijalva, for his 5 minutes. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate it, and thank you to the witnesses. Being from the West, Arizona, and having to deal with the increased and intense fire years that we've had in Arizona, the devastation that it's caused, loss of life that everybody else that spoke knows about, and some have experienced. I want to thank you for the hearing. I think it's very important to talk about how we invest in climate and conservation, and also how we invest in the safety and the health, both of our biosystems, and deal with issues about how natural resources can be a key in dealing with this climate crisis. It is part and parcel of why we're having this discussion. The intensity is linked to that and undeniable. Let me begin with Dr. Law and Dr. Schultz first. One of the issues that haven't been on this committee a while, that it's always an either or proposition when it comes to dealing with fire in our public lands. And it has to do, either you cut your way out of the problem, or suppose, and then the other issue is that it is a phenomenon that cannot be controlled. Climate change has changed that whole debate entirely, and the acceptance of that as fact has changed that. But could you talk a little bit or respond a little bit to what have been some successful collaborations and the role of robust research and science in formulating the strategy and the resources that are going to be necessary? And Mr. Chairman, I think you're right. Having this hearing is important as we address our administration, the Biden administration, the America's Jobs Plan, as to what resources need to match the need that you're discussing at this hearing. But if Dr. Law or Dr. Schultz would be able to respond to that question or make their comments regarding that.
Sure. This is Dr. Law. I've been working in Ponderosa Pine for over 20 years and on the east side of the Cascade Mountains, and have worked with a local ranger station there where they are very interested in the science. And they worked very carefully. That area is a recreation area, by the way, too. So it gets a lot of activity in there, and a lot of human-caused fires start over there. So they worked on, they were trying to retain the big old ponderosa type pine because they're beautiful and everybody appreciates them. So they did some thinning of some small trees that are in the canopies of the big trees, and the whole community got involved in doing that. And that was okay. These are small trees. We called them leaners because they would tip over. They're just too weak to make it anyway. And that ended up being a really good practice. But I think the big thing is they're reintroducing surface fires, the cool versus surface fires. And I think we need to do a lot more of that. You know, I had my training, my undergrad training in forestry and forest management. And we learned about underburning and how effective it was. And I think it's the way to go for a lot of these situations, especially when you're near neighborhoods and communities. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Chairman Grijalva. I could say that there are a number of collaborations going on under projects like the CFLRP projects where they've cleared large numbers of acres under really unprecedentedly large NEPA documents. Forefrey is an example of one of those, but then contracting and the ability to actually get the work done in a landscape there has been a huge challenge. But there are other projects here in Colorado, the Padre Plateau or our Front Range project, Southern Blues project, where I think there are wood byproducts that are coming off of those landscapes and keeping mills open, adding shifts. So there has been a benefit, but timber
Is it a resource question in terms of putting the collaborations together, or is it what we've heard from others today? It's an issue. It's a regulatory issue. It's a process issue. It's too many laws that are preventing us from expediting this. What is it?
Sure. So let me hit on a few things. I would say that, you know, timber harvest and fuels reduction projects or forest restoration, they're done for different purposes. You know, we actually hear that timber targets can send people to the wrong areas. It can take you away from your fire reduction priorities or from your collaborative group priorities. Under CFLRP, we hear there aren't enough markets for materials. There's millions of acres of acres through NEPA that are on the shelf, and there's just no money to implement it, or there's no markets for the work. So I think we have to think about wood byproducts can be a co-benefit, but this is really a public good that requires more investment. I also want to share on NEPA. People don't tell us NEPA is their primary problem. There's, like I said, a lot on the shelf, and only 1% of NEPA projects are litigated, and the majority of them are done under categorical exclusions already. So I think this is much more an issue of resource and capacity, and we don't have to choose between environmental law and forest restoration. I don't think that's the problem.
Thank you. Chairman, yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The chair now recognizes Ranking Member Fulcher for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Got a question for Mr. Daley, please. Mr. Daley, like you, I know a lot of ranchers in my home state that have a similar history that you and your family have. It dates back well over 100 years. I can't imagine what you've been through, and it's until you actually experience it, I suppose, there's just no possible way to communicate that. So just what do you believe would be some practical steps from your vantage point that you would like to see our country take and this leadership take to meaningfully address this crisis? You mentioned there were some efforts that some had taken locally, and I know there's obvious and justified frustration with all parties. But if you were king for a day, let's use that phrase, what would you recommend? What would you suggest that we do to take meaningful steps here to solve this?
Thank you very much for the question. And I think part of this is really recognizing that we have regional and ecosystem differences, and it is not one size fits all. That requires us to listen to local input in terms of what we should do. And that's the people who live and work on the land and in the communities that are most affected. It should not be political. It should not be one or the other. It should be to the center. Some of the practical things we could do, I'm worried about what the Forest Service will actually be able to do in our devastation of Plumas National Forest. I was up there the other day. Some of the private lands through our very comprehensive and difficult California timber harvest regulations are already removing the decadent disaster that we've seen. It was massive. The Forest Service, they will study it. And I apologize to them because I know there's good people in there, but the bureaucracy and the threat of litigation prevents us from doing the things that we need to do. A classic example is an iconic place in those mountains, a very small place, and I'll keep it short. The meadow that everyone likes to visit, recreation, was completely destroyed. Tamarack pines covered it all. I've been contacted by people, not ranchers, community members. Can we go clean that up? Can we help? I've asked the Forest Service. I expect an answer next year. That doesn't work. So I think immediately what we need to do is let these decisions become more local that benefits the people who live there, not people who live from a distance. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Follow up to that. So you mentioned during your testimony also that that some of the focus has been on thinning around defensible space areas, the more urban areas. I'd like you to expand on that just a little bit. And should that go outside those urban areas? And if so, why?
Absolutely. And the classic example would be the campfire that destroyed Paradise, or our fire, the fire that destroyed Berry Creek. You could have had a 2-mile radius around both those towns, absolutely barren and sprayed, and those towns would have burnt. This fire had so much fuel built up from public lands and was moving so fast with 60 miles an hour winds, it became 80 miles an hour winds because of the fire itself. It was spotting 3 to 5 miles ahead. We have to reduce those fuel loads. Obviously, harden communities as much as you can. It will help in smaller fires. These catastrophic major fires, we have to get to some of the fuel loads that are out and have been ignored for 100 years. Since we've decided to suppress fire. So yes, community resilience and hardening, I fully support it. It will help. It would not save towns with the current problems we have in the Sierra Nevada mountains and throughout the West.
Okay, thank you. You also touched on grazing. Talk to me a little bit more about grazing and the scientific soundness of that. What part of a role should grazing play in solving this problem?
I'll start by saying, although I'm a cattleman, I don't think it's a solution everywhere, but I do think it's a solution. We see goats grazing in New York Park, right? Now Central Park, and we see them grazing in other locations as a fine fuel reduction. There's good research recently from University of California Cooperative Extension on the amount of fine fuels that are removed by cows in California, or cows and sheep in California. It's incredible and it's important. Would those areas still burn? Most likely. Would they be catastrophic? Not if they don't have the fuel load. So appropriate targeted grazing, I'm not suggesting we turn cows loose everywhere. Appropriate targeted grazing is a very important solution along with prescribed fire.
Okay, and that was the last point. I think I've only got about 30 seconds left. So prescribed burns are a big focal point for many folks. Just share your thoughts. What's the role of prescribed burns in this whole equation? We've only got a few seconds left. I apologize.
Really quickly, we're forming prescribed fire associations in California. We have support from the administration in Sacramento to look at these. They do not fit everywhere, but they are an important tool. Unfortunately, our fuel loads are so high, we're going to have to be very careful how we do it, but it's a critical component that we need to bring back. The Native American cultural burning is a perfect example. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Daley. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Fulcher. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes, and I'd like to direct my questions first to you, Dr. Schultz. As I mentioned in the outset of today's hearing, have proposed investing billions of dollars in our public agencies, public land agencies, I should say, to support restoration and a new civilian climate corps. Based on your experience, I suspect you're familiar with the concept that we've laid out, and I wonder if you might be willing to opine as to how those investments could best be used and most effectively prioritized across the landscapes of, well, both Colorado and more broadly the Rocky Mountain West in order to maximize community protection and ecosystem resilience.
Yes, thank you for the question, Chairman Goose. I think increasing capacity for this work and with a strong external workforce would be a really positive step forward. Capacity, I think, is really the biggest barrier to making progress. I'd suggest that work be prioritized around communities and in municipal watersheds, and then also build on existing agreements and partnerships, things like the Forest to Faucets partnership here on the Front Range with Denver Water, or collaborative efforts in my backyard, like the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative. Work will need to occur across jurisdictions, so it'll be important that some of the work occurs in collaboration with state and local agencies. But I also want to acknowledge that when we're working on Forest Service lands, or even across jurisdictions, having adequate Forest Service capacity is also going to be a really big piece of the puzzle that we'll have to address.
Certainly, and that's certainly a priority of mine, and I think we're working to try to build a bipartisan consensus on that front. One other program, Dr. Schultz, I guess I'd like to ask you about, I'm sure you're familiar with the Joint Chiefs Partnership. We've been working on legislation to potentially codify the Joint Chiefs Restoration Partnership Initiative, which has been a very effective program in our view. As you know, similar to the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, which is authorized by law and was recently reauthorized, whereas the Joint Chiefs Program has been an administratively led effort. I wonder if you might be able to expound on the value of Congress actually authorizing the Joint Chiefs Partnership and hopefully doing so in a bipartisan way.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Maybe I should just start by clarifying for people who aren't familiar with it that while the CFLRP makes investments for 10 years on larger landscapes and on National Forest System lands and encourages cross-boundary planning, the Joint Chiefs Partnership is a little bit different. It's a partnership between the Forest Service and the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which really works primarily with private landowners. And they're really trying to do work across public and private lands for fire, wildlife, and watershed purposes. And there's projects all over the country, and we've studied many of them, and I've been really encouraged to see the results. People say that they're encouraging private landowners more than ever, better interagency collaboration than ever, leveraging capacity. So I think it's a real success. If it was authorized by Congress, I think that could afford the program a little bit more stability and also transparency over time, because right now it's an internal agency initiative. And I would also say on CFLRP, that's set to expire in 2023. So having a little more stability for that program as well could be really positive.
Thank you, Dr. Schultz. Finally, the remaining time I have left, I want to ask Ms. Duncan if you might be able to share with us some additional thoughts. I first, again, want to say thank you for your testimony, for your service. It's just incredibly powerful and certainly resonated with me, and I suspect every member of our committee on both sides of the aisle. You've obviously thought a lot about how best to prioritize the folks working as wildland firefighters. And so I wonder if you might just briefly restate, I only have about a minute left, but kind of restate for the public, for those who are watching today's proceedings, the four main reforms. I think you called them pillars in your testimony that you're proposing, because I think that they're compelling, and I'd like to see us move in implementing them.
Thank you, Chairman Nagoose. Yes, the grassroots wildland firefighters have four distinct pillars. First is wildland firefighter classification, pay, and benefits. And this is a significant increase in pay. We're talking about on-call pay, better retirement, and creation of a wildland fire series and buyback of temporary time. Our number two pillar is comprehensive health and well-being. So again, increased funding and support for those battling to stay healthy physically and mentally. We need significant reform in the Federal Office of Workers' Compensation under the Department of Labor and how we treat our injured firefighters. So that's one of our pillars, and long-term heart and lung care. Pillar number four, I'll skip to that, is Land Management Workforce and Resiliency Initiative. So I believe, Chairman Nagoose, your 21st CCC initiative with Senator Wyden is getting at the heart of that to provide more positions, more funding to bring people on to do the necessary restoration work, the fuels work, all the work that needs to be done on public lands. Our last pillar is a creation of a federal wildland fire workforce, which we're reluctant to even present that. We're not really spending a lot of time on that. It's kind of a last-ditch effort that if the 5 federal wildland fire agencies can't seem to figure this out, that may be the best route to go.
Thank you so much, Ms. Duncan. With that, I will now recognize Ranking Member Westerman for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman Nagoose, and again, thank you to the witnesses. You know, some of the most compelling testimony today, I believe, was from Mr. Daley and Ms. Duncan. And you could, in reading the emotion in it, you can certainly see the emotion in their testimony, how these catastrophic fires affect real people. They cost lives. They cause suicide. And as I read Ms. Duncan's testimony, and she draws the contrast to how wildland firefighters are really not even a group inside the Forest Service. These are people who are trained in land management that have to also work as wildland firefighters, and they're not even recognized. And comparatively speaking, the Forest Service employees are lower paid than other employees. And as I read that testimony, I thought, what if we weren't talking about wildland fire? So if you'll bear with me a minute, think about it like this. What if the testimony was about a city that was a poor city and it had an unusual number of fires, and the city just kept hiring more firefighters, and the fires kept getting worse, so they kept hiring more firefighters, and they were putting more fires out, and more firefighters were losing their lives, more property was being lost, but the fires kept raging. And then say there was a more wealthy city that was having the same problems, and their solution was to hire the firefighters out of the poor city to come fight the fires in their wealthy city. And Ms. Duncan talked about how California is hiring firefighters from the Forest Service and paying them double and triple what the Forest Service is paying. And suppose there was another city that they were having fires, but they figured out that the problem wasn't with putting fires out, it was actually trying to figure out how to prevent the fires. You know, it seems crazy to think that we continually focus on how we're going to put these fires out instead of focusing on how we're going to prevent the fires. If it were cities we were talking about instead of forests, there'd be a lot of effort looking at codes or whatever were causing these fires to happen. And I think that's the direction we need to go in looking at the forest. And Ms. Duncan, you said in your testimony that we either have a land management agency with a fire problem, or we have a fire agency with a land management problem. I think that's very well put, and I would say that it's probably more of the latter. We have a fire agency with a land management problem. What do you think we could do to fix that land management problem so that we're not having to hire more firefighters, so that we're not causing these catastrophic losses?
Well, I do think that, you know, the federal budgets for the land management agencies, not just in fire, have been in sharp decline. So all the resource areas, timber, recreation, wildlife, you know, have not been able to have the kind of workforce they've had in the past. And so part of it is a hiring problem, not just for fire. You know, to do, for example, prescribed burning, like Dr. Daley talked about, typically it's difficult to do that in the winter. There's snow, we don't have the conditions. And oftentimes prescribed burning and fuels work need to take place during fire season. And the firefighters are suppressing fires. We need an additional boost in the workforce to do the restoration work, to do the prescribed fire work, to be more proactive. Like I think you're saying, Congressman Westerman, is, you know, we've been so reactive. We're reacting to fires. We need to be more proactive. We need to do more work on the ground for restoration that includes a lot of different things.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself. And Dr. Daley did talk about how forest management is specific to different areas. I couldn't agree with that more. And we've talked about biodiversity and how fire helps that. I've got a paper I want to submit to the record. It's called "Is Fire for the Birds? How Two Rare Species Influence Fire Management Across the U.S." This was by the Ecological Society of America, published in July of 2019 in Frontiers in Ecological Environment. And part of it says here in a nutshell: frequent prescribed fire and restoration thinning have greatly improved red-cockaded woodpecker recovery in the southeastern U.S., while in the western U.S., large severe wildfires are a major threat to spotted owl. And I just want to read a little bit about biodiversity and what happened in my neck of the woods. It can happen in other places. said restored stands are characterized by a 3 to 7-fold increase in grass and forb productivity depending on the time of the fire. The benefits of this ecosystem management approach extend well beyond a single species. Research has demonstrated marked increases in a suite of at least 16 woodland, grassland, obligate songbirds, most of which are of special management concern. The small mammal community and game species of local interest have benefited, and plant and invertebrate communities, particularly lepidopterans, have also experienced substantial population growth. Treatments are funded by commercial timber sales. Sales receipts are distributed to the U.S. Treasury and local government, with a portion of the timber sale.
Mr. Ranking Member, I don't want to cut you off. I just want to make sure we're about 40 seconds over, but you can continue if it's just a little longer. But
yep, that was all I wanted to share from the paper. But there's a way to get the big trees to store more carbon. This particular project, they changed the rotation age from 70 years to 120 years so they could get larger trees, so they could get better habitat, and they sold timber and thin to get to that point and funded the project. So there's creative ways to do these things, and the benefits are tremendous. So if we'll just work together, I promise you we can come up with solutions where we implement the science across the country. I appreciate the extra time, and I yield back.
thank you, Ranking Member. With that, we will now I'll recognize, the distinguished gentleman, Mr. Sablon.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I come from a place where we really don't have large wildfires that just destroys huge forests and huge tree lines. We do have climate change has been responsible for rising sea levels and for huge storms. And 2016, 17, and 18, we had 4 large typhoons. In 2018, we had a typhoon that was the second largest in recorded U.S. history. Of course, because we're so far in the Pacific, 5,000 miles from California, 8 from DC, we don't get in the news. Right behind me, you see the American flag and the Forest Service flag. There should be 5 flagpoles there. And unfortunately, since Typhoon Yutu, the Park Service gave a contract to a Hawaii company to put up the additional 2 flagpoles, and up to today, it has not been fixed. But we're talking about wildfires here. Mr. Chairman, thank you for today's hearing, and I yield my time to Chairman Negus.
Well, thank you, Mr. Sablon, for your leadership and for continuing to be a champion for the people that you represent, and certainly are supportive of your efforts. I guess I would just simply say, with the time that Mr. Sablon has so generously yielded to me, that I do think there are bipartisan solutions that can address the wildfires that are becoming so pervasive across the Western United States. And I appreciate Mr. Westerman and Mr. Fulcher's thoughtfulness, and I think this hearing, certainly up to this point, has been incredibly productive in terms of having honest, candid conversations and hearing some powerful testimony from the witnesses about what we can do to help address some of these challenges. And I certainly pledge to approach these questions in good faith, because that's what my constituents who have been impacted by these terrible wildfires in a very visceral way expect. I would say, with respect to Mr. Westerman's point, he's right in the sense that we ought not focus simply on what we need to do from a suppression standpoint. And of course, that has to be a big part of the conversation. And I think the testimony that we heard today from Ms. Duncan, by way of example, is an indictment of the current system and the way in which we do not fund the incredible work that our wildland firefighters are doing every day, and the need for them to earn a living wage and for us to do more. It's certainly a priority for me. But Mr. Westerman is right. We also need to focus on how to prevent these wildfires from happening in the future. Obviously, a part of that is better forest management. And as I said, you'll have a partner in me in approaching that conversation in good faith, as we've done previously. But let's also not divorce what's happening from climate change and the reality that, in states like Colorado, the drought conditions have been exacerbated by climate change, and that is likely to continue. And these fires will become even more intense, and fire season will stretch into fire year. And I know Mr. Westerman is committed to having thoughtful conversations about that particular issue as well, because I think it's certainly part of the larger equation as we talk today about the impetus for why these wildfires are happening with such intensity in the West. So with that,
Gentlemen,
of course,
Yes,
I yield to the gentleman.
yeah, thank you, Chairman. I would say that a changing climate, hotter, drier conditions is more of an impetus to manage. But if you've got stressed, crowded forest, and you've got drier, hotter conditions, you're just creating more of a habitat for fire. So if we really want to, look at things like carbon in the atmosphere, if we want to look at keeping land forested instead of having these catastrophic fires, then we should really be focusing on management even more. When you create a management plan,
Mr. Westerman, I'll just reclaim my time there. I agree with you. I mean, like I said, I think you have good faith partners that are willing to figure out solutions with respect to forest management. It's part and parcel to our Civil Conservation Corps proposal. All I'm suggesting, though, is that we cannot leave behind the broader changes that we have to make to address climate change head on outside of the public lands context, because the reality is that as climate change continues to pose an existential threat to our planet and our way of life, it's not going to be enough to simply engage in better forest management. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we're going to have to do more. So in any event, that's obviously a broader conversation that we no doubt will have in the full committee and in the subcommittee as we go on. With that, I'll now yield, I believe the next Republican member was Representative Tiffany, but let me just check to make sure here. My apologies. Yes, it's Representative Tiffany, and then we'll go to Representative McClintock shortly thereafter.
Thank you, Chairman Neguse. Representative Tiffany here. And first of all, I want to thank Ms. Duncan for her work on behalf of the people of the United States of America, especially the people in the Western states. I think we have a fundamental question here between management and preservation, and the West has suffered under preservation for about the last 3 decades. And I would just like to direct a question to Dr. Daley. I believe that the Good Neighbor Authority has been quite successful since it was authorized a few years ago here. Wisconsin was the first state east of the Mississippi that's done that, and allowing some local management on our national forest. Do you see the same thing in your situation where local managers, whether it's local governments or private industry, can be more successful in managing these wildfire risks and just managing the resource generally?
Thank you for the question. I think we've seen some progress. Frankly, it's very little and it's late. I believe the Good Neighbor Authority for California talks about 500,000 acres federally and 500,000 acres at the state level. That's 1 million acres out of 100 million acres plus in California. We'll get there, but not in my lifetime. So it is a nice step. It needs to be more aggressive in terms of what we do in terms of treatment. Half of California is owned by the state or federal government. I don't know the numbers, but close to 2/3 of Oregon and 90% of Nevada, something like that. We need help at the federal level to work on those issues. Frankly, I'm getting much more cooperation from Sacramento at state level than I am federally in terms of trying to address these very pressing issues. I would like to mention very quickly, we don't do anything also after the fact with fire. And what we do, when it burns and burns quickly, this residual is set up for the next fire. And when we build in those areas, we're going to have another problem, because the work, I believe firmly we have to do more for prevention than suppression, but we have to also deal with after the fact problems in national forests.
I appreciate that very much. It was very interesting because it was about 30 years ago when I was reading an article in a national publication that said that the lack of management on our Western lands is ultimately going to lead to the call for people in government, as we see today, calling for more public dollars to do the management when we've driven out the private actors. When I hear things about industry capacity has been reduced, well, it's been reduced because they were ran out. We're seeing logging operations. We're seeing sawmills that have had to close their doors because they did not have access to timber that they had previously. And now we have these excess fuel loads being built up. That private industry was providing that service 20, 30 years ago without any subsidy. So we really went in the wrong direction. And I want to highlight an instance here in Wisconsin. We did a peer-reviewed study here in Wisconsin. We have about 1.5 million acres of national forest, and we have left about $250 million over the last 20 to 30 years of value on the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. But what we also did, by the lack of management, was we reduced biodiversity. It became a more stale ecosystem. It became a more sterile system where you don't have as many species that are in there, game species and things like that. And on top of it, just a couple years ago, as a result of that lack of management, where we had some beautiful mature trees that were due to be harvested, a windstorm came through before they could be harvested, trees that should have been harvested 5 to 10 years earlier, and cost us probably another $100 million. Those are dollars that could have went into the federal treasury to pay for these things that we're talking about today. I listened to Ms. Duncan talking about needing more money for wildfire suppression for those people to do that work. That money could have been generated if we would have been managing properly. It is time to restore the marketplace, to restore having private industry have a place that they can do the work that does not have to be subsidized. That would be the most effective thing that we can do at this point. We are digging a hole that was created by ourselves and federal management over the last 30 to 40 years that can be fixed, but it is not going to be fixed by another federal government program. Let's go back to things like the Good Neighbor Authority, expand it, and let's get the federal government working with people in California, like Dr. Daley and his neighbors, and then we will have much more effective management. We will generate more revenue for the federal treasury, and we will have fewer wildfires as a result of that. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Tiffany. Now, the chair now recognizes Representative DeGette.
I thank the chairman for recognizing me, and I want to thank my fellow Coloradoan for holding this hearing. Because you are the chairman, I will not argue with the statement that you said that your second congressional district was the best one in Colorado. I'll just stipulate for the purposes of this hearing that to be true. I do want to say, though, all of us in Colorado suffered from the terrible wildfires that we had last summer, and that even in Denver, which is my congressional district, people could not go outside for weeks on ends, people who had serious medical conditions. The smoke was so severe from our forest fires around the state, and it impacted public health, and it impacted communities across the state, as well as our tourism budget and our state budget. So this is an issue that is really really fundamental for everybody from the West. And it's important that we get it right, which is why I was so pleased to hear from all 4 of our witnesses that there is a growing consensus that A, we need more resources to deal with this, and B, we need more multifaceted approaches to deal with this. And I do want to thank you, Ms. Duncan, for your really moving statement about what it's like for the firefighters and the issues that they're having to deal with, and the lack of appropriate compensation for them every day. This is something we all worry about. And if everybody can mute, please. And frankly, I would say that this is something the federal government can and should address, because just letting it devolve to the states or to the local governments, it has a real patchwork approach. We see that in Colorado and all around. I want to just ask a couple of questions. Of course, I have to ask my homie, Dr. Schultz, a couple of questions. I found it very impressive, your testimony about cross-discipline and cross-agency research and development. And I was wondering if you could just expand on that testimony a little bit, talking about the scientific and technical advancements that we can actually use to model wildfire impacts and to incorporate real-time observations like weather, fuels composition, and air quality to facilitate beneficial fire management.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I think there is great work going on to increase the modeling of smoke and wildfire. And some of that work is occurring in here at CSU. Some of it is occurring with the Rocky Mountain Research Station and the U.S. Forest Service. And I guess I would highlight that we really do need interdisciplinary work. We need ecologists to track changes in our ecosystems. We need modelers to track changes in real time. We need social science to look at the policy, efficacy, social acceptability of these different approaches and some of the organizational challenges. And I think one of the things I would emphasize is that when we have science integrated into management, that means we have scientists working with land managers and other partners on the ground to actually support specific efforts as they're doing planning and even in real time. I'd also share that I think getting the agencies on the same page and working together for fire response, using some of the really new risk management approaches in fire response would be really beneficial. Similarly, when they're planning for climate vulnerabilities and climate adaptation, having the agencies and departments working together using similar processes can be really effective. I'll just say one last thing. I think improved monitoring of smoke and ventilation monitoring is going to be really important for prescribed fire. And there's going to be a need for more funding there, but I think there's some really good progress being made.
I think that's really true, and it'll help us. That type of information will help us as we try to move to the 30 by 30 climate paradigm. Wouldn't you agree with that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think collaborative groups are going to be, really helpful with the 30 by 30 goals in terms of looking at, where could this be designated? What could management look like? Ensuring that social and economic considerations are embedded with that. But I also think we'll need consistent definitions of what's protection and some kind of national guidance to get to that protection of 30% of lands and waters.
And if I can interrupt you real quick, because that was my question for Dr. Law. Do you think public lands protection are going to be part of that paradigm for the 30 by 30?
Yes, we've done an analysis of that, what it would take to accomplish that goal. And I think we're going to have that. There is a possibility of being able to do this. We did this analysis over the Western US and figured out just how much additional area would have to be protected. And of course, we would want permanent protections. And so that would be primarily the federal lands. But I think it's going to take a lot of different ways of thinking about this to narrow it down to exactly where those areas are and where we'll benefit the most by protecting them.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I'd love to have a copy of that analysis for this committee, if you wouldn't mind giving it to us, Dr. Law. I'd appreciate it.
Sure, that'd be fine.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you, Representative Duguette. And yes, I agree with you. We'll share that data when we get it with the members of the committee. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to tell you, I was stunned by something I heard from one of the Democratic witnesses. If I heard it correctly, it's basically we ought to leave our forests alone because they store carbon dioxide, and that wildfires and mass die-offs are still better than removing excess timber and maintaining a healthy forest. To me, that shows an ignorance of silviculture that is truly breathtaking. The simple facts are these: young growing trees absorb far more carbon dioxide than mature trees. An untended forest is no different than an untended garden. It's going to grow and grow until it chokes itself to death. It's estimated right now that the tree density in the Sierra Nevada is about 4 times more than the land can support. In this morbidly overcrowded condition, the trees are under extreme stress. They soon to succumb to disease and pestilence and drought, and ultimately to catastrophic wildfire. It is patently untrue that forest fires only consume litter and duck. The intense fires we've experienced have incinerated vast groves of dead and dying trees. And those that haven't died due to overcrowding and fire are often killed by the intense heat generated by the fire. In the aftermath of such a conflagration, Brush has first claim on the land, and within a few years, you see 6 to 8 feet of that dry brush building up. And then the dry, fire-killed trees begin to fall on top of that dry brush, which creates a perfect fire stack for a second-generation fire that utterly obliterates the field. It sterilizes the soil, and it takes hundreds of years for the trees to again rebuild a new forest. Because of this kind of nonsense that we heard today, we've seen draconian restrictions on logging and grazing and herbicide use on public lands that have made modern land management endlessly time-consuming and ultimately cost-prohibitive. The costs of this process exceed the value of the timber, which turns land maintenance from a revenue-generating activity to a revenue-consuming one. Since 1980, these laws have produced about an 80% decline in timber harvested off the federal forest and a concomitant increase in acreage destroyed by fire. As somebody just pointed out, in California, the number of sawmills has declined from 149 down to 27. I believe Mr. Tiffany mentioned the general question, actual numbers from 149 down to 27, just in California. Now, and it's not climate change. If the Democrats actually believe that if we would all just ride our bikes to work and set our thermostats to 80 degrees, that these wildfires will go away, they're completely delusional. Climate change doesn't explain the dramatic difference between the private forests that practice scientific forest management and the federal lands that are subject to these laws. The boundary lines between these forests are often easily identifiable from the air solely on the condition of the forests themselves. How clever of a climate to decimate only the lands that are hamstrung by these environmental laws. The climate has changed much over the centuries, but the problem has not. When Juan Cabrillo dropped anchor in Santa Monica Bay in October of 1542, this was the height of the Santa Ana fire season, he named it the Bay of Smoke. Before Western civilization, paleontologists tell us that we lost between 4 and 12 million acres a year to wildfire in California. Modern forest and land management brought that destruction down to a fairly steady 250,000 acres during the last half of the 20th century. Well, the annual destruction is now back up to 4.2 million acres last year in our state. That's not a new normal. That's the old normal reasserting itself. That's not climate change. That's how nature deals with overgrown lands. And once they're destroyed, they can take centuries for the forest to regrow. We began active forest management to break that cycle. We decided we wanted every generation to enjoy our forests. So we introduced scientific forest management so that we could do a little gardening and keep our forests healthy by suppressing brush and harvesting excess timber so it couldn't crowd itself to death. And it worked until environmental laws abandoned science for ideology. This planet's been warming and cooling for millennia. Warmer temperatures make it all the more important to match tree density to the ability of the land to support it. Forest fires and dead forests make a mockery of all the laws aimed at reducing carbon emissions. A burning or decaying forest releases carbon back into the air, while a growing forest absorbs enormous amounts of carbon. Milling surplus trees to make way for a healthy, growing forest sequesters their carbon indefinitely, and it renews the forest's ability to absorb still more. California, in particular, has taken draconian measures to reduce carbon dioxide emissions at a terrible cost for the quality of life of Californians. We now suffer some of the highest costs for energy in the country. We've destroyed our manufacturing base, and we can't guarantee enough electricity to keep the refrigerator running in the summer, and yet a single catastrophic fire makes a mockery of all of these
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
sacrifices imposed on our people. With that, I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Gentleman recognize Mr. Huffman for his point of order.
Just a point of order that the clock had expired. That was 5 minutes of partisan bile that we'll never get back. I yield.
You know what, Mr. Chairman, I've learned over the years that when people call you names, you know two things. You know you're winning the argument, and you know the other guy knows you're winning the argument.
Well, I'll ask at this point, the gentleman has yielded back. The parliamentary inquiry is not recognized, and we will proceed with the questioning. And next, we will yield to, or sorry, the chair will recognize a distinguished gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you so much to our panelists for making time. I'm actually going to use my time to ask you all questions. Thank you, Chairman Nagus, for your continued effort to speak the truth and bring fact-finding, mission in regards to what we're discussing during committee. But Michigan may not be known, as you all know, for wildfires. But as we speak right now, nearly 6,000 acres of our Huron-Manistee National Forest are consumed by the brittle fire as the Forest Service firefighters work to control the flames, reminding us that as climate change progresses, we are all vulnerable. There are thousands of communities at risk from wildfire, but it is typically the most vulnerable families and individuals that feel wildfires impacts the hardest. Many are low-income families that are not able to afford housing that is made of fire-resilient materials. Others may lack the mobility to evacuate quickly or struggle with smoke impacts. They also lack insurance and lost wages guarantees a lengthy, and of course the lack of insurance and lost wages guarantees that they'll have a lengthy recovery for years. We should obviously encourage landscaping design to protect homes from wildfires and invest in the fire resilience of homes of our most vulnerable. We have to support local communities in their fire planning, preparedness, and utilization of fire prevention resources. So Dr. Schultz, can you elaborate on why planning collaboration across jurisdictions and among diverse stakeholders is so important for developing fire policy that protects our most vulnerable neighbors?
Yes, thank you for that question. I completely agree with you. There's a lot of evidence that poor and marginalized communities are left behind after disasters and after disturbance events, not just fires, but hurricanes and flooding events. And so we really have to think about how to have more equitable approaches to preparing for those and also for how we respond to them so that post-disturbance people aren't left behind in rebuilding efforts or efforts to come back to those communities. I would say that one of the things we need to do is much more significant outreach that reaches vulnerable communities, and it needs to be done in these diverse formats conducted through community-based forums and relying on leaders from within those communities to really build trust and establish legitimacy. And it takes time and resources to do that well and sincerely. Collaboratives need time to do that kind of capacity building. They need funding to do it. There are some good examples of the Fire Adapted Communities Networks working more closely with Latinx communities, but I think there's tremendous room to grow in this area.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Schultz. I mean, it sounds very clearly that we have to listen to the people most impacted and take what we learn from there and respond with a meaningful change in policy. Ms. Duncan, I know you already spoke to a lot of this, and it really was impactful what you spoke about, but can you talk more about the challenges facing our overworked and underpaid wildland federal firefighters and how increasing pay and transitioning to a full-time workforce would be critical in combating wildfires in our nation?
Thank you, Congresswoman Tlaib, for that question. We really, our point is that we can't sustain a year-round fire workforce without adequate pay, a decent living wage. They go hand in hand. We can't have one without the other. I think a lot of people don't realize that federal wildland firefighters travel all over the entire nation. I mean, that is our job. We respond to the call, and that takes us away from our homes and our families, oftentimes for almost the entire summer in big fire seasons that we're seeing now every year. That just takes its toll on families and not being there for their children's birthdays and anniversaries and funerals and weddings. And it's, we used to have more of a break, but with these long fire seasons, we're just not getting that. And I do want to thank you for bringing up, that this is not just a Western problem. I mean, I think we all remember the fires that swept through Gatlinburg, Tennessee in 2016, absolutely devastating. So this is more than just a Western problem, it's a national problem.
No, and it's so important to connect consistently. As somebody from a city, as Chairman Nagus will tell you, I'm trying to connect how we're all really connected. I mean, the air, everything that happens in other communities. I want to thank you, Ms. Duncan, and of course, all of the panelists. I truly believe it's unacceptable that we are asking federal wildland firefighters to protect the vast territories for just pennies on the dollar. And I hope we really take action in this committee to raise pay and benefits to support our firefighters as the professionals that they are. So thank you so much, and I yield.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you, Ms. Leap. The chair now recognizes, is Representative Moore still with us? And if not, we will we'll go to Representative Rosendale. Representative Moore is here.
Chairman, yeah, I'm here. I wasn't sure if you were going to Rosendale before me, so I can definitely address now. I'm actually in one of my rural areas, so I'm a little remote.
The chair recognizes you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and grateful for the opportunity to discuss this in very important issue. Bipartisan Wildfire Caucus, along with my colleague from Utah, John Curtis, and look forward to definitely being
and Representative Moore, we're having just a little bit of technical difficulty hearing you. Well, let's do this. Representative Moore, we will come back to you because we know how that works, the travails of traveling the district and engaging with folks, committee as well. So certainly understand that. And why don't we turn to Representative Rosendale? We'll yield him 5 minutes to him and then come back to Representative Moore when he's available.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate this opportunity to discuss the looming wildfire season and ways we can work to mitigate the risk of catastrophic wildfires. Unfortunately, what I've heard from many of my Democratic colleagues today was more of the same scare tactics and science denial that they apply to nearly every issue. What's happening is clear. Democrats and extreme environmental groups are working in concert, abusing our laws to engage in an endless cycle of litigation to shut down responsible forest management.
I can hear everything.
And
Just
all the while,
hear me.
and all the while the West burns. Habitat is destroyed. Megatons of carbon dioxide are released into the atmosphere. People lose their homes and their loved ones, as we have heard earlier from Ms. Duncan. Air quality is destroyed, causing major health issues. We know the recipe to reduce the risk of these catastrophic fires. We can take proactive steps, including targeting accumulated vegetation, healthy timber management programs, hazardous fuels management, whether it be timber sales, prescribed burns, mechanical treatments. This will protect our environment and create sustainable forest. After years of watching the West burn, I hope my colleagues will come to their senses and work with Republicans to reduce regulation and reform our system of litigation that gets in the way of these common sense wildfire mitigation practices. Locking up our forest is not forest management. Dr. Daley, I want to thank you for your testimony and your work with the Public Lands Council to fight for responsible management of our public lands and shine a light on the role of overregulation and environmental litigation play in preventing catastrophic wildfires. So I'd like to ask you, litigation seems to be a major hurdle to proper management. This is 3 parts. Please touch base on the equal access to justice laws, their original intent, how they've been abused, and what changes you would recommend so that they could be restored to their original intent. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Rosendale. I'll be honest, I don't know if I want to get into details of Equal Access to Justice Act because I'm not an expert. I will tell you clearly that it has delayed many of the things that we know need to be done in the West and throughout the United States. And I understand the intent, and that is that we want to have a thorough and vetted process as we move forward. The challenge is it stops progress. I would like to make 2 additional comments, and they're germane to your question, I believe. I worry that we will have a very good discussion and hearing and then both sides retreat to their camps. And those of us who suffer, who saw people, know people who died in their cars trying to escape, will see no change. Because we're going to see arguments about what to do. Is it preservation? Is it management? Is it this? Is it that? We need to do something. And I am concerned that we will not listen to the great middle. And the great middle are not in extremes. We know we are faced with a significant, catastrophic wildfire season facing us that has destroyed towns and homes. Part of that is regulation. Part of that's debate. Part of that's lack of resources. To us on the ground, I don't care what it is. Can't we do something? And I really feel like we aren't willing to do that because we so get into our hard camps of what the right approach is. So I apologize that I'm not directly addressing your question, but I do obviously know litigation is one of the impediments for any of the progress we can make. I can tell you of a major fire to the south of here called the Creek Fire, which almost took Yosemite National Park and took chunks of it. And I was on a call with a group of cattlemen and recreationalists and people who lost their homes and their lives, not their lives, obviously their homes, their resources. The Forest Service was on the line. He said, well, we want to do this, we want to do that, but there may be litigation. We aren't sure what we can do. That is inappropriate to what we're trying to move forward with. And lastly, in case it's my last question, any of you, all of you, your staff, please come see me. Don't do this remotely. Let's walk into a place of catastrophic wildfire, see the true impacts, see that that ecosystem is not just lightly touched, it is devastated. I have an expert in range who was there who said, there's no humus left. There's nothing to regenerate. The fire was so hot. I apologize for my passion. Thank you.
It seems
Thank you.
my time is up, Mr. Chair, so I will yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Ms. Leger Fernandez for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chair, for holding this important this hearing, and the witnesses for sharing their personal and professional stories and their passion. You know, the heroes that risked their lives to fight our forest fires deserve our support, not just our thanks, but real resources and support. I myself, for my toddler days, I've spent time in our mountain forests, you know, in our high mountain pastures with cattle and maintaining acequias, which are the, centuries old irrigation dishes that bring mountain snowmelt to our fields and orchards. I know wildland firefight as well. I was the first young woman hired to assist the state of New Mexico Forest Service during fire season. All 5 of my brothers fought forest fires. But, you know, as was noted earlier, there's no such thing as wildfire season anymore. In New Mexico, we've had 153 wildfires this year alone, and it's not June, which used to be our wildfire season. And as representative to get recognized, this affects New Mexico's health, our economy, our tourism, and just our traditional way of life. But I would also acknowledge that climate change is setting the conditions for more frequent and intense wildfires in New Mexico and across the country. And first and foremost, we must pass the legislation to fight the climate crisis, to keep our communities safe, because that's what's looking at the root causes of these fires. Ms. Schultz, thank you very much for your testimony on the importance of place-based solutions. You suggested, I believe, a 40 to 60 billion investment. How would this money be distributed to the place-based partners? And especially, you know, I want to talk because of where I sit, where we have Native American tribes, ranchers, small rural communities, Hispano, Latino, Latinx communities. So how would your suggestion of place-based partnership and these resources, how would these resources help those partners?
Thank you for that question. So that estimate comes from, you know, people that I've seen that figure we need about $1,000 an acre to do treatment, and that if we could prioritize treatment across jurisdictions, we could actually treat a relatively small percentage of the landscape and have outsized effects. But I think it absolutely would have to go across jurisdictions. So what I would recommend is that we use science at the national level to really prioritize, you know, where there are carbon benefits or benefits for reducing community exposure. but then we defer to the state level and the local level planning processes in your state. There's just been amazing progress with New Mexico State Forestry and the regional office working to identify priorities, share data, and work with local communities to look at where the priority work is across the state, and then really double down on those collaborative efforts that have been so robust there for decades. So I think there's a lot of potential to invest in those partnerships, and how you would structure that additional funding so that it goes towards those partnerships and also goes to places with a plan to really manage fire, I think is really the tricky question, but I think is something that could be done.
Thank you. I like the idea of both using traditional communities, science, and then putting the resources we need. In New Mexico, we have these hotshot crews, and we know they play a critical part in our ability to fight fires. Once again, these highly skilled and elite groups are often composed of Native Americans and individuals from our Hispano rural communities. Ms. Duncan, you discussed how the low compensation benefits and recognition provided to our wildland firefighters have hurt the first responders and caused such pain. I want to know more about what Congress can do to help with this, and what would moving to a more permanent, higher paid system help with providing hotshots and other highly qualified state, tribal, and federal firefighters the help they need.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and thanks for your service and that of your brothers. It's so complex because there are 5 different federal agencies. So it has to be bigger than the agencies. And we really need legislators like you all and the administration to take the lead to pass real meaningful reforms to make these agencies work with the Office of Personnel Management, Office of Management and Budget to work very directly and quickly to move forward with a new series and then tie additional pay to that. I think most people would be shocked to know an entry-level wildland firefighter makes less than $14 an hour. That's embarrassing, and it's amazing that that's what these people who risk their lives, make for a living. It's a tragedy.
Right, risk their lives, their lungs, and like their future health. My time has expired. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Moore for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Can I get a quick thumbs up? You can hear me okay?
We can hear you great.
Great, awesome. I'll jump right into some questions. Apologies for the technical difficulties, but I am up here with some county commissioners from Rich County, which shares a border with my friends from Idaho. And this is an issue that is near and dear to a lot of people's hearts. And I will emphasize my commitment to the great middle that Mr. Daley said. It is a little elusive sometimes, the great middle. I know it's there. And my commitment to Chairman by joining the bipartisan wildfire caucus is hopefully a way that I can show that. So let me jump into these questions. Most of them, it's about the relationship between proper forest management of the current fire cycle. In your opinion, what are some of the most egregious examples of
With our apologies, Mr. Moore, I think your sound is coming in a bit scattered. It sounded like, could you repeat which witness you're directing the question to? That's quite, looks like we may have lost Mr. Moore.
Is he able to ask the questions maybe
Mr.
without
Daley?
the video?
This should work a little bit better.
It's great. And Mr. Moore, you may turn off, what might work is if you turn off your video, it might help with the audio.
Yeah, and it might have been my Bluetooth. So, Mr. Daley, just real quick, what are some of the more egregious examples of poor forest management?
I believe that was directed to me, and I apologize for the challenge. Obviously, I gave a couple of examples earlier, but I see a variety of things. One of those is our unwillingness to move forward. Most things, I understand that NEPA has been completed in places, but sheer resources to actually get things done and move are critical in many of these projects. And again, I think they vary from site to site. And the problem is we apply similar standards across so many different ecosystems that are not appropriate. I think there needs to be a recognition, at very least at the region level within the forests, within the Forest Service or the BLM districts, that there should be some authority to work within that particular region to have adaptive management that makes sense. That may be fuel load reduction through mastication, it may be through grazing, it may be through prescribed fire, it may be none of the above. But we don't have the flexibility for that to occur. So that's a continuing issue we see. And as I said, I think a place that we've missed entirely is post-fire management. Post-fire management, to wait 2 years to complete an archaeological study after the place has been destroyed makes zero sense. We need to move immediately. If the state of California can, I would assume that the federal government should be able to figure out how to move quickly to deal in post-fire management, which creates another fire issue secondarily. Thank you.
Could you actually relate this a little bit into a private land versus a public land discussion? That's something that's really, really important in Utah per se, because we have such vast public lands. And I hear constantly from county commissioners, like, you know, sometimes we see in the exact same area, but just line that exists between private and public, different results. Could you communicate a little bit or just comment on, you know, what you've seen work well in private land that could be applied to public land?
Certainly, and thank you for the question. Private lands in California, of which I own some and manage, those tend to be entirely different because we've been able to do some of the things we need to be done on public lands, and we've done it historically. And that includes everything from water improvement to fuel load reduction to prescribed fire. Many of these prescribed fire associations that are being formed, not by ranchers, but by community members, are talking about how do we reduce fuel loads, and they can only do it on their private lands. An example, there's a small fire association up around Paradise, which is burnt in the campfire. They want to use some state funds to introduce goats around the community for fuel load reduction. They can't do it without CEQA. They don't have the money for CEQA, our equivalent of NEPA in California. It's a ridiculous requirement that we know exists because of a hole that someone didn't think of when they crafted a regulation. So what we're doing is we're limiting opportunity to protect and build a fire resilient community we have a better chance on private lands. I'm doing something with Farm Service Agency on fuel load reductions on private lands through the National Resources Conservation Service. And at least I have a chance there. It's burdensome, it's complex, it's difficult, takes years, but it's still better than the Forest Service or BLM can do.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Daley. I won't jump into any more questions given the time, but just thanks for the perspective. The other witnesses, thank you for perspective. There is an opportunity in the Great Middle. I'll put another plug in for that concept and sincerely hope to work with Chairman Neguse and John Curtis on this as we move forward. So thank you all, and apologize for the difficulties.
No apology necessary. Thank you, Mr. Moore, for your participation. The chair now recognizes the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, for 5 minutes.
Well, Chair Neguse, thank you for holding this very important hearing. I'm so glad that we've got your leadership at this subcommittee, and I'm glad you chose this subject for one of our first hearings. And really, for everyone involved, with very few exceptions, there's been a real spirit of substance and problem solving and a good faith desire to find ways to make progress. That is what we're going to need. Unfortunately, there are still going to be some that prefer the fight to the solution. But I think we've had some just excellent testimony here today. And Mr. Daley, don't apologize for your passion. It's part of what makes your testimony so compelling. Ms. Duncan, you talked about how many of the things that we need to do are going to take place on the shoulders of fire season when firefighters are needed to suppress fires. That'll probably become even more so as our fire seasons grow longer and longer. So when we think about the proactive treatment that all of us want to see done, controlled burns and other things, you're helping make the case for something that Chairman Neguse has really led on, this Climate Conservation Corps. We're going to need resources like that to do the treatment work while we have our suppression crews doing their difficult work. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, absolutely. We do need a workforce that boosts up and is able to do that work that still is ongoing and needs to be done even when there are fires going.
So many times people want to point to the shiny object that will make this vexing problem go away. And for some, it's, blaming environmentalists or dragging out some longstanding agenda to get rid of NEPA and other environmental laws. Invariably, I've found there are ways to make good projects happen on the ground if we have the will and the resources. So, one thing I hope we can take away from this is let's make sure our federal agencies have the NEPA teams and the resource specialists they need. It costs money, but when they can do timely surveys and consultations and other things, and when we can weigh in as members representing cooperatives and others that are trying to do these projects, we can move stuff forward. We really can make a difference. You don't have to always have a flashy act of Congress that that some look to as a silver bullet. But what we do on the ground also needs to be targeted. And so, Ms. Schultz, I want to ask you a little bit about the importance of focusing in the wildland-urban interface if we're concerned about resilience and making things better in the face of these worsening conditions. Why should we target those areas? And within those areas, what are the smartest strategies?
Yeah, thank you for that question. The science definitely indicates that if our concern is protecting human infrastructure and communities, we need to work in and around homes. And a lot of ignitions actually start off of federal lands. It's really important to reduce fuels in that home ignition zone and in the community protection zone. If we are going to do treatments on public lands in the wildland urban interface, they're usually fuel reduction treatments. Those fuel reduction treatments can be thinning and prescribed fire, and that can be helpful for reducing some of the exposure to communities, providing a little bit more opportunity for safe response by firefighters, and supporting ingress and egress. But I will note that those fuel reduction treatments often take out more trees than you would do really for a pure forest restoration purpose. And sometimes it's a little challenging to do prescribed fire right near communities, but we've seen it done here in Colorado. And there have been recently some fires, I think in California, where cultural burning's taken place, and it's been for WUI treatment and also has had other cultural and ecological benefits.
Definitely. Mr. Lamalfa and I both represent the Karuk tribe, which practices the same kind of proactive fire treatments that many of the experts and fire ecologists always talk about. They have to go on bended knee every year to the Forest Service to simply get permission to do these things in areas that are their ancestral lands. We've got to find better ways to make that happen. But there has also been the suggestion, again, back to the shiny objects that some people want to look to on this complex challenge, that somehow if we just do what private land does and more actively log, that we'll have more resilience. Ms. Law, I think you're coming to us from Oregon, where terrible catastrophic fires ripped through heavily cut over private forest lands last year. Could you weigh in on that, please?
Yeah, well, what I noticed in the areas, I went over to some of the burn areas and walked through them, and we experienced the smoke heavily here. But what we noticed was it was like houses along the main roads. This is out in the forest, more of the wildland area. The houses were burned to the ground, but the trees around them weren't. And so we figured out that it was the propane tanks and probably the power lines at the time, because there was no sign of any other way. How could it have taken the houses out, but not the rest? And that's why I get back to the real need for this hardening homes. That's what everybody's trying to do. And I heard people down in Southern Oregon are going to think about, just like what you do in Florida, build concrete homes, because if you rebuild wood homes, they're going to burn again. So there are other ways to look at things, and we're learning as we go too.
Thank you. My time has expired, but Mr. Chairman, I yield back with my thanks for such an excellent hearing with such great witnesses.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor, and thank you, Mr. Huffman, for your kind words. The chair now recognizes Mr. Lamalfa, if he is present. I'm going to give him an opportunity to ask any questions that he might have. We'll just give him a few seconds here. Okay, I believe Representative Porter is also on, and so why don't we, the chair will recognize Ms. Porter for 5 minutes, and we'll go back to Mr. Lamal.
Thank you very much, Chair Nagus. Ms. Duncan, as someone with over 30 years in forest management, you've seen firsthand how wildfires have become more difficult to contain. When you started your career, about how long was wildfire season?
That's a great question, Congresswoman. It was certainly maybe July and August. The Western fire season, it might start a little early and go a little bit into September. And it wasn't every year either. We would go 1 or 2, 3 years with no big fires.
So a couple of months, not necessarily every year. Tell me about wildfire season today.
Right. So wildfire season today is closer to what we're now starting to say a fire year. So here in Oregon, you know, I live on the west side of Oregon that is typically a little wetter, a little rainier, but we're having, you know, a small drought right now. We have a large drought, but I mean a short-term lack of rain. So we're getting wildfires now in April. They actually had to evacuate some communities outside of Bend, Oregon a month ago for fires. So certainly we're seeing it now every year where we're starting earlier, and we fight fire here until November. So I would say March through November.
Through November, so many, many months, almost a full year. And do you know what percentage of the Forest Service budget was devoted to wildfires in 1995?
Well, it certainly wasn't anywhere near what it is now, approaching 50%. It was significantly less.
Yeah, it was around 16%. And now it's close to half, as you said. Has the amount of land burned each year increased during your career?
It has. We've certainly seen the higher number of fires, more acres burned, and certainly fires are burning with higher intensity and much more severe fire effects than we've seen in the past.
And so the fire season's gotten longer. Wildfires are consuming more of the Forest Service budget, and wildfires are more widespread. Has funding for the Forest Service kept up to equip it with the resources it needs?
It has not, and all program areas have seen severely declining budgets. And although the fire budget takes up the majority of the full budget, it's still not enough. We're still trying really hard to make ends meet and using duct tape and Band-Aids and struggling to get all the work done.
Well, and as a mom from Orange County, California, over half of my district is preserved land, including the Cleveland National Forest. And it really concerns me that federal forest management agencies don't have the resources they need. So I just want to speak up in support of scaling up our funding to fight wildfires to meet the reality of the problem that we have. I also wanted to ask you about how we're supporting the people who do this work. How much does an entry-level federal firefighter who's based in California or on the West Coast make?
So an entry level is GS3, and right now the base pay is $13.52 an hour. There are certain places in California and others that have a higher locality pay. But most places in the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management are rural. We don't have the higher locality pay that we get. So below $14 an hour.
Below $14 an hour to put your life on the line.
Yes, ma'am.
How much does that compare to how much some of our state agencies like CAL FIRE pay? What's their starting pay, if you know?
CAL FIRE, their starting pay is double that. They start at about $26 an hour. And through all the positions up from an entry-level firefighter to someone like at my level, the unit chief level, it's 40 to 50% more than the federal workforce makes. And a lot of the municipal departments that do wildland are the same.
So Ms. Duncan, help me understand. Why would anyone want to be a federal firefighter and get paid $13.45 below what we've been pressing for as the minimum wage, even for jobs that don't require this kind of training and this kind of risk to your person? Why would anyone become a federal firefighter instead of a state firefighter where the pay is nearly double?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, and we're struggling to hire people now into those entry-level positions. We're struggling to staff our engines and our crews because of that. So We still do have some who it's a summer job. It's to put themselves through college. They've grown up in the community where there's a Forest Service office or Bureau of Land Management. So it's an easy jump for them to get into that. But they get bit by the fire bug. They love the career and then find themselves making it difficult to meet ends, financial ends.
Yeah, my time has expired, but I would just encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to go to usajobs.gov and search for Forest Service jobs, and you'll see that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of unfilled Forest Service positions, and they're almost all in entry-level fire. So I just think we have a real problem with recruiting, with morale, with retention, and it's because we have not let the budget and the investment keep up with the scope of the problem. So I just want to close by thanking you for your service, Ms. Duncan, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you, Ms. Porter. Gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. LaMalfa for 5 minutes.
Thanks again, Chairman Nagoose. Had trouble finding the button on the machine here quickly enough last time, so you know how that goes. But anyway, I'll never be as Zoom proficient as maybe others, but I appreciate Ms. Porter's thoughts there too. We're working on legislation we've had for a couple of Congresses now on reclassifying our forest technicians into the wildland firefighters they are. So Ms. Duncan, following on that, I hope we can get some more. It's a bipartisan legislation with Mr. DeSaulnier, but let's get some more folks on board and push that through this time, because we get the classification going, then we can start remedying the pay schedule as well too. So I think it's one step at a time around here. So, but you know, to some of the current thought here, I personally am part of several pieces of legislation that are bipartisan. You know, what having to do with forest management, or you know, Mr. Huffman and I have been working on for several years on the Plant Act, we've called it, to cut down on the illegal activities going on in the forest that introduce so much harm and dangerous chemicals due to the growth of cannabis going on out illegally in our forested areas. And so this is how we're going to get somewhere on doing this as a bipartisan effort. So what I wanted to, and so Ms. Duncan, I just wanted to focus on that. So briefly, could you tell me what are the frustrations you find within Forest Service, not with the great work that our firefighters are doing when, you know, when they're given the ability, but what are the other things? Because we have a lot of frustration with some of the focus. Sometimes we have local issues here where they're, you know, trying to regulate who can go on Lake Shasta and other issues, a local center for learning, and they're regulating the heck out of things like that, even on Easter, of the use of the parks. We call them up, we finally get the results, but they're not doing the work. What do you find from within inside the organization, Ms. Duncan, that is taking the focus away on the work we need to be doing while they're nitpicking on small things?
Well, Congressman, I can tell you that the employees inside the agency are passionate about the work in the land and serving the American people, and are able to do quite a bit. It's amazing the passion and the work they bring to the job, to work around regulations and requirements that we have to do. But you know, we're able to get a lot of work done, a lot of really good work done. So certainly it's a challenge. There are regulations that we have to follow. That's part of the job, and we forge ahead and try to continue to serve the people. Sorry, I feel like I'm rambling. That's probably not a good answer.
No, that's okay. Yeah, it's okay. It's an open-ended deal. Ms. Duncan, please contact our office with ideas. We're just trying to find ways to move more effectively within the law, or change the law where it's needed on that, you know, because we want to be streamlined in what we need to be done. And,
Thank you.
You know, Dr. Daley here, we saw his frustration with things needlessly not happening in his area and many of our Western areas. Dr. Daley, I know you more by day, but what would you like to finish the thought on here on what we could focus on? You know, we have bipartisan efforts here. I have friends on both sides of the aisle, but what can we really focus on in this term, in this coming year, with moving the ball effectively and much more speedily? Because really it is, a lot of it is federal lands that we're talking about. That's the problem. We've worked on more clearance around power lines. I have another bill on that. More clearance along highways. So, the hazards that come from traffic along highways, we can mitigate better and prevent. Just what should we close my 5 minutes on with effective ways of doing this?
Thank you, Congressman LaMalfa. I think, pardon me, in many cases, the challenge at the federal level is that it takes too long to move anything forward. And I think part of the problem we have here is all of a sudden it seems like we've got into this logging versus preservation debate rather than what can we do. As you well know, and as I've invited people, and this country, to come out and see the Sierra Nevada mountains, they are choked with brush. They are choked with low-growing fuels that are 10 to 15 high surrounding large conifers. We need programs that will address the opportunity to remove those in a cost-effective manner that can partner with private landowners, partner with public lands in ways that actually create defensible spaces. This cannot be, I certainly want to see communities hardened, resilient, but it has to be a much broader space when you see and witnessed what we have seen in Butte County, California, and throughout California. These are mega fires. They are not simply going to be fixed by a small solution. So let's see what we can do to do fuel load reduction. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I get that. We need to have much more partnerships, as Mr. Huffman was talking about with the UROC up there. Why do they have to go hat in hand every year to do things that they probably know better for many years on forest management? We need to find these partnerships and have pre-authorization. Just be able to sign a paper. Hey, here's what we're going to do. We've already done it before. This isn't new. Nothing new under the sun here. Do that with our counties. Do that with our local agencies, our fire safe councils. They know what needs to be done. Why do we have to litigate the heck out of this stuff and take so much time not getting going on that, And so we need the Forest Service to be much more willing cooperators. And if they don't have the authority, then tell us how to attack the bring the legislation that attacks this problem that we need to streamline, because we're highly frustrated. And, however you want to look at the climate change situation, whether it's man-made or whether it's nature or what have you, or whatever combination, the climate is causing an issue that we need to address by doing forest management. And I'll throw on the other side saying water storage in a parched California too. If our snowpack is no longer snowpack, but what rain we do get washes right down the river, then we got to have more buckets to keep the water in. So when we talk about climate change, what is it we're going to do proactively right now to do the forestry needed, to do the water storage needed to respond to that and quit hampering ourselves? With that, Chairman, thank you for the time. Thanks for letting me be in on my old committee here. I miss it, but times change on how many committees I get to keep. So, and to our panelists here for your time and for your great expertise, we look forward to working with you some more. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back, and of course he's welcome. He's welcome anytime.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to thank the witnesses for their incredibly valuable testimony, each and every one of them. Thank you for taking the time out of your very busy days to share your testimony with us. I want to thank the members for their thoughtful questions. I certainly believe that you were. Let me. I think hold on 1 minute, Mr. Westerman, and then I'll defer. I'll recognize you.
I was just going to ask if we could maybe do a second round of questions before we close out.
Yeah, no. So I had planned to address that. So just let me first say again, thank you to the witnesses and thank you to the members for their thoughtful questions. And I want to also recognize what Representative Huffman said with respect to Mr. Daley, your passion and the passion of all the witnesses. We appreciate your passion, and we are just as passionate about getting something done. And the fact that this subcommittee has only held 2 hearings this year, and that this was the second hearing is evidence of the fact that we are taking it very seriously and that the subcommittee intends to move aggressively. I know that there is interest in a second round of questions. Some of the members of the committee have some additional questions for the witnesses. Unfortunately, we're at risk of losing a quorum, and so in light of the schedules for some of the other members of our committee, we'll proceed with allowing members to submit additional questions in writing, and would ask each of the witnesses if they are willing to respond to those questions in writing. I suspect that you'll have many questions from members who were able to participate today, as well as members who were not able to participate. And my office intends to submit some additional questions as well, because we'd like to to participate in some additional rounds of questioning. So with that, under Committee Rule 3, subparagraph O, members of the committee must submit those written questions to witnesses within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. And again, want to thank Ranking Member Westerman for that request. Understand that we can't accommodate it today, but nonetheless, certainly appreciate you raising it. If there are no further, or rather, if there's no further business, without objection, the subcommittee.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Westerman.
I was thinking you were going to call on me to.
Oh, go ahead. I recognize you, Mr. Westman. Apologize.
Okay. Now, my understanding was where 2 are gathered together, we have a quorum in a hearing, but I understand we need to move on. But I've got some. It's actually about 20 research papers for the record I would like to submit, and these articles reflect scientific consensus that forest management and the use of harvested wood products is not just good for local jobs and rural communities, they're beneficial for our environment and climate as well. The articles I'm submitting include 2 articles that found that Washington forest products industry was a net carbon mitigator for the state and sequestered an equivalent of 12% of the state's total greenhouse gas emissions. Several articles supporting the carbon sequestration benefits of wood products, including mass timber buildings. According to the scientific research I'm submitting, mass timber buildings can sequester 9% of global carbon emissions if used as a substitution for other materials. I'm also submitting articles in support of the Trillion Trees Act and Natural Climate Solutions as a way we can address climate change. In fact, the research in these articles suggests that smart solutions like reforestation can sequester the equivalent of 21% of net annual emissions in the United States. And finally, I'm submitting numerous articles that discuss the carbon sequestration benefits of forest management, as well as the other benefits management has for the environment, like improved wildlife habitat. Therefore, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that these articles be included in today's record, and I appreciate the time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back without objection. Those materials will be entered into the record. Again, I want to thank the witnesses, thank the members, the ranking member of the full committee, as well as the ranking member of the subcommittee. And with that, the subcommittee stands adjourned.